Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a question that gets right to the heart of what religious belief actually is. We're asking, when someone makes a religious claim like saying God exists, or maybe God loves humanity, or even there's life after death, are they making a statement about objective fact? Things that are true or false about reality itself? Or is something else entirely going on with that kind of language?
That is a huge question.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's exactly what we're tackling today.
We've pulled together a stack of material, and it's centered around some really key excerpts from a foundational philosophical text that really grapples with this head on. Our mission today is to unpack the central argument this author is making. We want to wrestle with the alternative viewpoints they're critiquing, the ones they're pushing back against, and we want to see why this might feel like, an abstract philosophical question, but it actually has massive implications for anyone trying to understand faith, doubt, and the very language we use when we talk about religion.
That's exactly right. This deep dive takes us into a really critical and honestly, a long-running debate within the philosophy of religion. The author we're looking at presents a really powerful case, I think, for the idea that central religious affirmations, and they draw heavily from the Christian tradition as their main example, are fundamentally factual assertions, claims about the actual nature of reality. They aren't just, say, expressions of feeling or statements of intent or ways of life, although they might involve those things too. At their core, the author argues, they are claims about the way things are.
Okay, let's unpack that core idea. Religion, at its heart, is fact asserting. And to really get that, we need to see what it's being contrasted with, what the alternatives are. Our source material pushes back against several other ways people have thought about religious claims. This ranges from maybe simpler, more popular ideas like, oh, religion is just about being useful or providing comfort.
Right, the pragmatic view.
Exactly. To much more sophisticated philosophical arguments, like the idea that religious language is really its own thing, an autonomous language game, you might say, with its own internal rules kind of separate from everyday factual claims. We're going to dig into how the author uses specific examples and arguments to build their case against these alternatives.
And as we explore this, we'll definitely need to keep sight of the bigger picture. What does this all mean for how we think about the big questions? God's existence, the nature of belief itself, doubt, and how does this understanding of religious language connect with the really challenging aspects of life? Suffering, for instance, or even questions about the future, like life after death. It's really a deep dive into the very structure, the architecture, and the meaning of religious language itself.
Absolutely. This is the kind of topic that can fundamentally shift how you think about faith, regardless of your own position. So get ready to go deep with us into this source material. Now, the author starts their argument by sharing an observation. They noticed a significant shift, particularly in how people talked about religion in the United States back in the 1950s.
Yeah.
What was this shift? What did the author feel it was signaling?
Yeah, it was a really profound change in focus, almost a reorientation. The author observed that where discussions about faith and religion, maybe just a generation or two before, would have centered quite naturally on the reality of God.
Right, his nature, his existence.
Exactly. His actions in the world, his purpose, that was the subject.
Yeah.
But the conversation shifted increasingly to focus on religion itself. Religion treated primarily as a human phenomenon, something people do. So instead of asking, is God real? The dominant question started becoming, what is religion? And what does it do for people or society?
So it sounds like God went from being the ultimate subject, the sort of the central reality around which everything else revolved, to being maybe just one item within the study of human religious behavior, like a concept that religious people use.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. The author points out this happened on two levels. Academically, in universities, the study moved towards the history of religion, the psychology of religion, the sociology of religion. God became a concept discussed alongside things like cult, ritual, taboo, all seen as parts of the religious phenomenon being studied from the outside, as it were. And then at a more popular level, religion was often framed primarily as a human activity aimed at achieving personal well-being, psychological harmony, social cohesion, things like that. The crucial contrast here, the author stresses, is that in this newer view, God is effectively understood in terms of religion. God is seen as maybe a symbol or an idea or useful concept that religion employs. This is a complete flip from the older understanding, where religion was understood in terms of God as humanity's response to what was believed to be a real, independent, supernatural divine being.
And this fundamental change in focus, it naturally changed the kinds of questions people were asking, didn't it?
Fundamentally, yes. The traditional, most pressing question about God was always, does God exist? Is this being real? That's a question about truth, about reality. But when the focus shifts to religion as a human activity, well, the question of its existence doesn't really come up. I mean, obviously, religion exists as a social and psychological phenomenon. You can observe it. So the new pressing questions became practical ones. What purposes does religion serve? Is it useful? Is it beneficial? How can we make it more effective? And under this pressure, the author argues, the original question of the objective truth of religious claims, are they actually describing reality, tended to fade into the background. Practical value, utility, took center stage.
The author gives a personal example that really seemed to crystallize this for them. From looking at student essays in a philosophy of religion course, what did they notice there?
Yeah, they describe reading hundreds of these essays. And what struck them forcefully was that the vast majority of students seemed to have only a rather dim, perhaps vague grasp of the idea that religious beliefs could be true or false in a factual sense. But in contrast, they had a very clear, very keen sense of the psychological and social value of religious beliefs and practices. It wasn't that truth was explicitly rejected necessarily, but usefulness, relevance, psychological benefit, that was definitely the dominant lens through which they viewed religion.
That really resonates with a lot of the way religion is talked about today, doesn't it? You know, the idea that religious teachings are good because they offer comfort or help you cope with difficulties or build strong communities.
Absolutely. The source mentions specific examples like sermons that treat biblical stories primarily as illustrations of psychotherapy principles or mental hygiene. It even notes extremes where the Christian gospel was almost equated with something like the power of positive thinking. And this, the author suggests, contributed to a public image of religious leaders, ministers, priests as providers of valuable social welfare services. Things like moral education, mental health support, bolstering national morale, community building, activities often validated by their practical, quantifiable results.
Now, the author isn't dismissing the value of those services, right? They're not saying helping people isn't good, but what's the core concern about this shift in emphasis?
Exactly. The value of those functions isn't the issue. The author's crucial point is that arguments based entirely on pragmatic value, on utility, on social function, on psychological benefits, had essentially replaced, or at least overshadowed, the traditional understanding. The traditional view saw religion as primarily about proclaiming great and saving truths, about bearing witness to all-important transcendent realities, realities believed to exist whether or not they happen to be useful or comforting to us at any given moment. So it's a shift from proclaiming truth about God to discussing the utility of religion, a very different orientation.
And the author suggests this focus on utility might be a kind of replacement, a substitute for something that's maybe been lost in modern culture.
Yes, they explicitly pose that question. Is this pragmatic emphasis a surrogate, a natural stand-in for older, perhaps waning religious conviction in what many saw as a less faith-filled age? And they bring in a really interesting perspective here from the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill. Mill himself was an agnostic, not a traditional believer. Mill observed something similar in his time. He argued that if people genuinely truly accepted religion's core teachings as true as positive facts about reality, the question of whether it was useful wouldn't even cross their minds. Why would it? You believe it because it's true. For Mill, arguing for religion's utility only becomes prominent, only seems necessary, when the arguments for its actual truth have largely stopped being convincing for many people. He saw it as taking an inferior ground of defense, a weaker position.
And Mill felt this focus on utility primarily appealed to people who were already skeptical, maybe half-believers, and that it could even encourage a kind of insincerity, or perhaps a way of avoiding wrestling with genuine doubt about the truth claims.
Precisely that. And the author reinforces this point by adding Bertrand Russell's very sharp, almost biting comment on the matter. Russell, the famous 20th century philosopher and atheist, said he could respect someone who argued that religion is true and therefore it ought to be believed. That's a logical position, whether you agree or not. But he felt, and he used strong language, profound moral reprobation for those who argue that religion ought to be believed because it is useful, while dismissing or sidestepping the question of whether it's actually true. That's a really stark ethical and philosophical dividing line Russell drew there.
Wow. That highlights a really fundamental difference in orientation, doesn't it? It's not just a minor difference in emphasis.
It really, really is. The source draws a sharp contrast between serving and worshiping God and simply being interested in religion. If God is conceived as a real independent being, the creator, the ultimate reality, then we as creatures stand in a relationship of potential awe, maybe even judgment, before something infinitely superior. Our whole lives are, in a sense, open before him. But If religion is viewed primarily as just a human cultural phenomenon, a human activity that we evaluate, then we occupy the role of the appraiser, the judge. We decide whether to cultivate it, how to use it. God then becomes merely an idea, a concept, a symbol within the human phenomenon that we are appraising. There's no imperative in that view to bear our lives before divine judgment. Instead, we analyze, define, maybe even revise the concept of God to suit our needs or understanding. This is fundamentally different from the posture of worship or service towards a living reality believed to exist independently of us.
So where does the author trace the historical roots of this pragmatic cultural view of religion? How did it become so influential?
The author sees it as a kind of logical development, almost an inevitable one, within an increasingly technological society that was heavily influenced by certain philosophical trends, particularly scientism, positivism, and naturalism. These perspectives, really fueled by the massive success and growth of science, tend to assume that genuine knowledge, real truth, is primarily discovered by applying scientific methods to phenomena we could observe and measure.
And the key distinction here for this line of thought is that God isn't really an observable phenomenon amenable to direct scientific study, but religion, as human behavior, is observable.
Exactly that. You can't put God in a test tube. You can't observe God under a microscope. You can't run controlled experiments on divine action in the way science investigates the natural world. But religion as human behavior, as historical texts, as social institutions, as psychological experiences, that stuff is observable. You can study it historically, psychologically, sociologically.
So the logic goes something like this. Because religion is scientifically investable in ways that God, as traditionally conceived, isn't, God gets subtly redefined, becomes identified primarily as an idea or a concept within the scientifically studiable phenomenon of religion.
That's the logical step the author describes. And underlying this entire shift is a crucial, often unstated philosophical assumption. Namely, that the traditional categories of truth and falsity, as they apply to scientific facts or everyday empirical claims, the cat is on the mat, simply don't apply in the same way to core religious beliefs like God loves mankind. This assumption that religious claims aren't factual in the ordinary sense is what leads directly into the big contemporary debate the author really wants to get into, the cognitive versus non-cognitive debate about religious language. Do religious statements attempt to describe facts, making them cognitive, or do they primarily perform some other function entirely, making them non-cognitive?
The source uses the analogy of poetry here, which is helpful for understanding the non-cognitive side of that debate.
Yes, it's a useful analogy. You don't typically read a sonnet and ask, is this literally factually true? Its power, its truth, if you want to call it that, operates on a different level. It might evoke feelings, express a unique perspective, use powerful imagery in a non-literal way. So the question arising from this line of thought is the kind of truth claimed for religious statements perhaps more like poetic truth or mythological truth than ordinary factual truth? Are they perhaps grand myths whose value lies elsewhere than in literal factuality?
And this whole discussion perfectly sets the stage for the author's main argument, which, as you said, they divide into two key parts.
Right. The author's core thesis is really twofold. First, and this is the main thrust, they argue that it's absolutely vital, critically important to insist that the central affirmations of Christian faith do possess a genuinely factual character. They are, at root, claims about reality. But second, and this is important too, they argue that given this essential factual core, there's still plenty of legitimate room, even necessity, for using non-factual language, things like myth, symbol, poetry, to articulate and explore the profound mysteries that surround that factual core. They actually suggest we look at that second point about myth and symbol first.
Okay, that's interesting. So the author isn't arguing that all religious language must be strictly factual. They're making space for myth and symbol.
Yes, that's a crucial clarification. The source explicitly states that a significant amount, a large admixture of mythological material, meaning language that is non-factual but still religiously significant, has long been recognized within religious traditions, within scripture, and within creeds. The author points to a long history of thinkers acknowledging this, from someone like Origen back in the 3rd century, right up to modern theologians like Rudolf Bultmann in the 20th century, who famously talk about demythologizing the New Testament. The presence of myth isn't denied.
And there's always going to be discussion about whether a specific phrase or story should be taken as factual or as mythological, right?
Absolutely. The author anticipates ongoing, keen, and even heated discussions about how to classify particular items. Is this creedal statement literal fact, or is it symbolic myth? That debate will continue. But the general point is that very few thoughtful people today, the author suggests, would deny that religious discourse, as we find it, includes a considerable element that functions mythologically or symbolically. And the source gives the example of Bishop James A. Pike to illustrate this very practically.
Ah, yes, Bishop Pike. How did he demonstrate this distinction in his own practice or understanding?
Well, Bishop Pike apparently stated quite openly that there were several phrases commonly recited in the Christian creed, things like, Jesus sitteth on the right hand of the Father, or ascended into heaven, or even conceived by the Holy Ghost and born of the Virgin Mary, that he personally could not affirm as literal, factual prose statements. But, he said, he could certainly sing them. He saw them as a kind of war song, using poetic terms to picture major convictions. He felt he could sing them with, in his words, a real affirmation as to the place of Christ in the whole situation, even if he didn't take them as literal descriptions of physical events or spatial locations.
That's a really powerful illustration, isn't it? He saw these phrases not as straightforward descriptions of, say, celestial geography or biological processes, but as symbolic or poetic ways of affirming something profoundly true, in his view, about Christ's nature, his status, his significance.
It really highlights the category of language the author is acknowledging here. The author agrees that this kind of language exists and is a legitimate part of religious discourse. Now, someone else might disagree with Bishop Pike's specific classifications, perhaps arguing that some of those phrases were intended as factual claims by the original authors or believers, but the category itself, the category of religiously significant, non-literal, mythological, or symbolic language, that category is valid, the author maintains. The author even adds that it's hardly a radical idea to suggest that the factual framework of Christian beliefs might have gaps, areas of mystery that are filled, if they're filled at all within the tradition, by myth or symbol rather than by further factual assertion.
Okay, so if this non-factual mythological language is valuable and legitimate, how does the author distinguish it from just, making things up? From pure fantasy or whimsical imagination? What gives these particular myths their religious weight and significance?
That's a key question. The author argues that these religiously significant myths are distinguished from arbitrary flights of fancy precisely because of their relation to a framework of factual belief. They aren't standalone creations. They supplement, they adorn, they often emerge from and express a deeper core of factual belief and serious theological intention. Take the myth or symbol of Christ ascending to sit at God's right hand. The author suggests this isn't just a random piece of imagery. It arises from and expresses this conviction that, in some real way, though perhaps not in a way we can literally picture, Jesus Christ holds a position of ultimate authority, ultimate sovereignty over the world, sharing in God's rule. The power and the appropriateness of this myth, the author contends, comes directly from its context within surrounding non-mythological beliefs. Beliefs in the literal reality of God himself and the literal reality of God's decisive action in and through the historical person of Jesus Christ. The myth draws its meaning, its significance, from this underlying factual foundation.
So, the idea is that myth, to be religiously meaningful in this specific way, needs a factual anchor. It's somehow dependent on or parasitic upon the factual claims.
Yes, the author actually uses that very word, parasitic. They state quite clearly that valuable or significant myth is necessarily parasitic upon non-mythological beliefs. The crucial point here is this. If you had an entire system of religious beliefs that was considered purely non-factual, mythological from top to bottom, with no grounding in claims about objective reality, then, the author argues, none of those beliefs could possess the particular kind of significance that depends on having a connection with objective reality, with how things actually are.
Yeah.
Myths that are woven into a system believed to be factually grounded can gain a kind of derivative significance, pointing towards those facts. But myths in a purely mythological system, one with no factual claims at all, just define their own imagined realm. They forfeit what the author calls their cognitive value, their ability to inform us, even indirectly, about what is real outside the myth itself.
Right. And this conclusion brings us right back around to the author's core assertion, their first and main thesis, that at its base, Christianity, as they understand it, must insist on the genuinely factual character of its most basic central claims.
Exactly. The author feels it's necessary to strongly restate and defend this traditional position, that core religious claims are factual in nature, specifically because of the challenge from various contemporary philosophical views that argue religious language is exclusively non-cognitive. As we touched on earlier, many philosophers, particularly influenced by movements like logical positivism or later developments in the philosophy of language, came to believe that there simply cannot be facts of the kind that traditional religious statements seem to assert. The very idea of God as a factual entity, or divine action as a factual event became seen as deeply problematic, perhaps even meaningless, within these philosophical frameworks. So since they don't see religious statements as making factual claims, these philosophers naturally started looking for other functions the language might be performing. As the source points out, some suggested it's primarily about expressing a particular way of seeing the world, a unique perspective, or blick, citing philosophers like John Wisdom. Others, like J.H. Randall, whom we discussed, saw it as symbolic expression of human values and experiences. Still others suggested it declares an intention to live a certain way, perhaps following an ethical code associated with religious stories, like R.B. Braithwaite argued. Or maybe it's a unique kind of utterance altogether, a form of convictional language that isn't meant to be indicative of facts at all, as someone like W. Zerdig proposed.
And J.H. Randall, whom we mentioned earlier in relation to that cultural shift towards utility, is presented as a particularly clear and significant example of this view of religion as solely a human construct devoid of factual claims about the supernatural.
Yes, Randall is highlighted as a very clear proponent of this purely symbolic, non-cognitive view. He argues quite explicitly that religion is fundamentally a distinctive human enterprise that's socially necessary and valuable for human culture. But in his view, any lingering superstitious belief in a real, actually existing divine being should be completely abandoned by what he considers enlightened modern religion. For Randall, theology isn't about describing God. It's properly understood as an imaginative and symbolic rendering of men's moral experience and ideals. All religious beliefs on this account are purely symbolic. Randall describes four main functions for these religious symbols. First, they stimulate people towards moral action. Second, they help bind communities together socially. Third, they communicate a unique quality of human experience, something best captured by poetry and symbol rather than literal description. And fourth, they open our eyes to what he calls the order of splendor in the world, the deeper, perhaps aesthetic or emotional dimensions of existence. So while Randall clearly values religion highly for its role in enriching human life, he sees it as entirely intramundane, existing solely within this world, within human experience and culture. There's simply no place in his system for a transcendent God as a factual reality.
And the author points out a really key, maybe even unargued, assumption Randall makes in reaching this conclusion.
They do, yes. The author notes that Randall seems to proceed entirely on the assumption that belief in the actual reality of God is simply absurd and completely out of the question for 20th century man. And, crucially, the author points out that within the specific text they're discussing, Randall offers no reasons, no arguments for this fundamental assumption. He appears to just take it as a given starting point for his analysis of religion's function.
And given that starting point, the author sees Randall's position not just as a reinterpretation or a modernization of Christianity, but actually as its obituary, a declaration of its death.
Because, from the author's perspective, the core faith described in the Bible and lived out by the historical Christian church for 2 millennia is completely, utterly dependent on the conviction that God really exists. Not just as a helpful concept or a powerful symbol or a projection of our ideals, but as the actual creator and sustainer of the entire universe, the ultimate reality with whom humanity has to do, and whose purpose for humanity is genuinely good and loving. This conviction, for the author, inherently involves making factual claims about the way reality actually is, and this brings them directly into dialogue with another major challenge to the factual nature of religious claims, the neo-Wittgensteinian approach, which focuses very much on the nature of language itself.
So the source next turns to engage with a philosophical position heavily influenced by the later work of the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, often associated with thinkers like Professor Dewi Z. Phillips. And the author presents their first major thesis, their first main point in response to this approach.
Right, the author's first thesis directed against this neo-Wittgensteinian view is quite direct and foundational. The actual language used in Christian discourse, when you look at scriptures, creeds, prayers, sermons, the way believers actually talk, this language presupposes that it is a factual truth that God exists. This isn't presented as an optional extra or a hypothesis within the language. The author argues the very use of the language, as practiced by the religious community, takes God's factual existence for granted as its basis.
But Phillips, as presented in the source, seems to disagree strongly with this idea that the language necessarily points to or presupposes a factual reality outside the language itself.
Yes, that seems to be the core of the disagreement. The source quotes Phillips saying things that challenge this. For instance, to have the idea of God is to know God. The author interprets this as suggesting that knowing God might be tied solely to possessing the concept of God, implying there might not be a separate, meaningful question about whether God exists independently of people having and using that concept. Another quote attributed to Phillips is, "What the believer learns is religious language. What I am suggesting is that to know how to use this language is to know God." This again seems to tightly link knowing God not to encountering an external reality, but rather to mastering the internal rules and practices of a specific linguistic system, a language game.
And how does this perspective, according to the author's reading of Phillips, understand atheism? If knowing God is knowing the language, what is not knowing God?
As the source describes it, Phillips appears to consider the only philosophically legitimate form of atheism to be the simple recognition that religion means nothing to one or has no meaning for me. Atheism, in this view, is seen essentially as an inability to make sense of or to participate meaningfully in the religious language game. It's like not understanding the rules or finding the game pointless.
So this implies that standard atheist arguments, the kind you usually hear, like it's irrational to believe God exists, or there's no sufficient evidence, or the very concept of God is logically incoherent, or maybe it's statistically more probable that God doesn't exist. All these are considered philosophically out of bounds, not genuine or proper philosophical questions.
Precisely. If those kinds of negative claims about the reality of God or the rationality of belief, are deemed philosophically improper or confused from the outset, then it follows logically that the corresponding positive claims God exists, it is rational to believe in God, must also be seen as philosophically improper questions within this particular framework. You can't ask if God exists, only what the concept means within the game.
And the author clearly sees this move as effectively denying that core religious statements can be factually true or false in the way we normally understand factual claims.
Yes. Because if the fundamental claim of God's existence isn't even allowed as a proper factual question that philosophy can address, then statements that seem to depend on that existence like God loves mankind or God guides the universe cannot themselves be treated as straightforward factual claims about reality. This connects right back to the heart of the cognitive and uncognitive debate we mentioned. As the source notes, this view draws partly from the verificationist idea, prominent in earlier logical positivism, that for a statement about existence to be meaningful, it must make some kind of observable, experienceable difference. And it also draws on the later, more general philosophical awareness, influenced by Wittgenstein himself, that language performs many diverse functions besides just stating facts.
So the crucial question becomes, does a statement like God loves mankind assert a fact that would, in principle, make an objective, perhaps eventually experienceable, difference in the universe? Or is it doing something else entirely, like expressing a feeling, a commitment, a way of seeing things?
That's the absolute crux of the debate as the author describes it. And they point out something quite interesting logically. If you're a cognitivist, someone who believes religious claims are fundamentally factual, you can still readily agree that asserting such a fact also expresses an emotion or an attitude or a commitment. Stating a fact often carries emotional weight. But if you're a non-cognitivist believing the claims are not factual, you cannot easily say that expressing an emotion or adopting an attitude also asserts an objective fact about the world, other than perhaps the psychological fact that you hold that attitude. The asymmetry is important.
And the author argues that Phillips makes a key, perhaps unwarranted, assumption when he characterizes atheism merely as religion meaning nothing to one.
Yes. The author believes Phillips is assuming here that the actual use of religious language by believers doesn't inherently involve or entail a belief in God's real, objective existence. But the author pushes back against this by appealing directly to how typical believers actually use the language in practice. They point to very common examples. Someone saying God is a very present help in trouble, or affirming that the Lord God omnipotent reigneth, or beginning a prayer with, O God, from whom all holy desires proceed. The author argues that a statement like God is a help logically entails, it requires for its truth, that God actually exists to be a help, and prayers inherently presuppose the existence of the being they are addressed to. And crucially, the author contends that typical users of this language intend these entailments and presuppositions. They aren't just playing a language game according to internal rules. They genuinely believe they are referring to or addressing a real being who exists independently of their words.
What would a typical religious person likely say, according to the author, if you actually stopped them mid-prayer or mid-statement and asked if they were assuming a real being exists?
According to the source, the author is quite confident about this. If you asked a typical believer, look, when you say that, are you assuming that there actually is a being whom you are addressing or referring to, an eternal, omnipotent God, etc.? The author believes they would unhesitatingly reply, yes, of course I am. And if you then press further, maybe using more philosophical terminology, asking something like, okay, and do you regard it as an objective fact that God exists, the fact that would still be true even if no one knew it or believed it? The author believes the typical user of Christian language would still unhesitatingly say yes. From this appeal to lived religious language use, the author draws their conclusion for this first thesis. Christian language, as actually spoken and practiced by its living community, inherently presupposes the extra-linguistic reality of God, a reality believed to exist independently of the language itself or the people using it. And this sets up their next point about the logical consequences that follow from making a factual claim.
Okay, that makes sense. So building on that first point, that Christian discourse inherently assumes and affirms God's factual reality outside the language game itself, the author then presents their second main thesis.
Yes, the second thesis follows directly and logically from the first. Because Christian discourse affirms God's factual reality, it necessarily and automatically gives rise to an entirely proper and legitimate question concerning the actual truth or falsity of that affirmation. The author's point here is a basic logical one. Whenever someone makes any kind of factual claim about the world, it is always logically appropriate, always in order, to ask whether that claim is justified, whether it's actually true. If central religious assertions are, as the author argues, factual claims in their nature, then you cannot logically maintain both that they are factually true or false, and that there's no proper question to be asked about which one they are, true or false. The claim itself invites the question of its truth.
But Phillips, again, as interpreted by the author, seems reluctant to admit this question of God's factual truth as a proper or meaningful philosophical question.
That's right. The source quotes Phillips making a revealing comparison between asking about the reality of the physical world and asking about the reality of God. Phillips apparently suggests that asking about the reality of the physical world for a philosopher isn't really asking if the physical world exists, because who could seriously doubt that? Instead, he says, it's a conceptual question about the kind of reality the physical world has, about clarifying the concept of material object. He then applies this directly to God. Similarly, Phillips is quoted as saying, the question of the reality of God, which is of interest to the philosopher, is a question about a kind of reality, a question about the possibility of giving an account of the distinction between truth and falsity, sense and nonsense, in religion. So for Phillips, it seems the philosopher's job is restricted to clarifying concepts and rules within the religious context, not stepping outside to ask about correspondence with an external reality.
So Phillips seems to be drawing a parallel. Just like you can't meaningfully stand outside the language of physical objects and ask if the physical world exists because you're already using that language to ask the question, maybe you can't meaningfully stand outside the language of God and ask if God exists if you're using that language framework. You can only clarify what you mean within it. Is that the idea?
That appears to be the parallel Phillips draws, according to the author's presentation. But the author finds this parallel deeply problematic, calling it explicitly question-begging. The author argues the comparison completely fails because the contexts are fundamentally different. The crucial difference is that, for all practical purposes, everyone is a user of language about physical objects. There's a universal consensus, a shared framework, within which we operate when we talk about tables and chairs. In that context of universal agreement, there's arguably no one in a position to genuinely and seriously ask the external question, does the physical world exist? So asking about its reality naturally becomes a conceptual question about what material object means within that shared framework. But the author points out emphatically this is absolutely not the case with the language of God. By no means everyone is a user of theistic language. On the contrary, there are many people, atheists, agnostics, people from different religious traditions, or none, who do seriously and genuinely question and ask whether the God described in theistic language actually exists. The context for discussing God's reality is one of profound and widespread dispute, not universal agreement. Therefore, the author argues, asking about the kind of reality in the case of the universally accepted physical world, and asking about the kind of reality in the case of the widely disputed concept of God, are two very diverse kinds of inquiry. The question about God's reality is fundamentally a question of existence and fact, precisely because it's disputed, unlike the conceptual question about the physical world within its context of universal acceptance.
That's a sharp critique of the analogy. The source also notes that Phillips might try to connect his view to philosophical discussions around the ontological argument, particularly those by philosophers like Norman Malcolm, who argued God's existence is necessary. How does the author respond to that potential link?
The author anticipates this connection and addresses it. They acknowledge that the traditional concept of God is indeed unique in that, if God exists, God's existence is generally understood to be non-contingent. That means God isn't the kind of thing that could just happen to exist or happen not to exist, like a particular planet or person. The concept implies God's existence must be either logically necessary, God couldn't possibly not exist, or logically impossible. The concept is contradictory. Philosophers like Norman Malcolm, building on Anselm's ontological argument, argued that necessary non-existence, impossibility, could be ruled out, and therefore God must necessarily exist. But the author makes a crucial clarification here. Even if you accept the premise that God's existence, if it obtains at all, is non-contingent, that God is eternal, uncaused, independent, the fundamental philosophical question still remains. Does such a necessary being actually exist, as opposed to necessarily not existing? It becomes a question about which necessity holds. Necessary exist or necessary non-existence, impossibility. The author contends that even if philosophy could definitively settle this question, which is itself highly debated among philosophers, it would still be a perfectly good question about the ultimate nature of reality, a question about what actually is the case. It wouldn't just be about clarifying a concept within a language game. It would be about whether a reality corresponding to that concept obtains.
Right. And this leads directly into the author's third main thesis, which tackles the proper role of philosophy itself in this whole debate about religious belief.
Exactly. The third thesis builds on the previous two. It states that philosophical considerations are indeed relevant and potentially very helpful in deciding whether or not it is reasonable for a person to believe that God exists. This directly challenges the view, attributed to Phillips, that philosophy should remain essentially neutral or restricted, merely analyzing the logic of religious language without engaging in evaluating the justification or reasonableness of the claims made within that language.
And Phillips, according to the source, seems to take quite a restricted view of philosophy's competence here, particularly regarding positive justification for belief.
Yes, that's how the author presents Phillips' position. The source suggests Phillips seems willing to grant that philosophy might play a negative role, for instance. Philosophical criticism could potentially show that a particular religious belief is internally contradictory or incoherent, thus demonstrating that it's unreasonable to hold it. But Phillips appears to deny philosophy a corresponding positive role in providing reasons for belief, or in establishing the reasonableness of belief. The source quotes Phillips, stating quite strongly, the whole conception of religion standing in need of justification is confused. For Phillips, in this reading, philosophy's proper job is simply to clarify meaning, to make explicit what is already there in the language game. It leaves everything as it is, meaning it doesn't change beliefs or offer justifications. It's seen as distinct from apologetics, the practice of defending faith. The philosopher's task on this view is to ask what it means to affirm or deny God, not whether it's reasonable to do so or whether God actually exists.
And the author then raises some quite pointed questions about why philosophy should be limited in this way. What are those questions?
They ask some fundamental questions about this restricted view. Does this definition really mean philosophy simply cannot offer arguments, reasons, or considerations regarding whether claims about, say, the existence of an infinite, personal, loving being are belief-worthy? Is it plausible that philosophy has nothing to contribute to assessing the reasonableness of such a momentous belief? If philosophy truly leaves everything as it is, does that imply it can't aid us in the fundamental human quest to figure out how things are, to discern what is real and what isn't? The author acknowledges that philosophy might not be able to definitively prove or disprove God's existence in a way that compels universal assent. But, they ask, can it not help us decide if it's reasonable to believe that God exists, precisely by doing what Phillips says it should do, by clarifying what such a belief actually entails and examining whether those entailments are coherent and plausible?
The example of the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, comes back in here to illustrate this point about clarification leading to evaluation, doesn't it?
It does. It's used as a concrete, albeit simple, illustration. The author imagines someone, perhaps like Gagarin, who might have held a very naive concept of God, maybe picturing God as a kind of large, physical entity residing somewhere up in the sky, who would have been visible from a spacecraft if he existed. In such a case, the author argues, philosophy can certainly step in. Its first job is to clarify that specific concept of God being used. And having clarified this naive anthropomorphic concept, philosophy can then reasonably conclude that, given everything else we know about space, physics, and the universe, it is highly unreasonable to believe that God, conceived in that particular way, exists. The clarification leads directly to an assessment of reasonableness. Now, the author readily admits this process is vastly more complex and difficult when dealing with the sophisticated, abstract, non-anthropomorphic concepts of God found in developed theology and philosophy. But the underlying principle, they argue, remains the same. The act of clarifying a concept, even a very profound and difficult one, doesn't automatically preclude philosophy from then going on to consider whether a reality corresponding to that clarified concept could logically exist, and whether, based on all available considerations, it's reasonable to believe that it does.
So, the author fundamentally feels that Phillips's definition of philosophy's role is just too narrow, too restrictive. It cuts philosophy off from asking important questions.
Yes, that's the clear implication. The author feels Phillips defines philosophy too narrowly, essentially limiting it to a kind of descriptive conceptual analysis, observing and analyzing the rules and concepts within different language games, like religion, science, morality, but not allowing it to critically evaluate the truth claims or the reasonableness of the beliefs expressed within those games, especially concerning their relation to reality outside the game. In this very limited role, the philosopher becomes rather like a detached anthropologist studying a tribe's belief system. They can meticulously describe the beliefs and how they function within the tribe's culture, but they are barred as philosophers from making judgments about whether those beliefs are actually true or fundamentally mistaken about the nature of reality. They couldn't conclude, for instance, that a belief in a divine being is objectively false if they adhere strictly to this definition of philosophy.
And the author points out, perhaps with a touch of wry humor aimed at their own profession, that this highly restricted definition of philosophy would effectively eliminate many of the central and most enduring topics within the field of philosophy of religion.
Absolutely. The author provides a list of standard, important topics in philosophy of religion that would seem to fall outside this narrow definition. This includes things like studying and evaluating arguments for God's existence, traditional theistic arguments, assessing the cognitive value, the knowledge-gaining potential of religious experience, examining the complex relationship between religious beliefs and scientific beliefs, critically comparing the competing truth claims made by different world religions, investigating naturalistic explanations for the origin and persistence of religious belief. And, very significantly, it would exclude grappling philosophically with the profound challenge posed to theistic belief by the existence of evil and suffering in the world, the problem of evil. These are all topics, the author dryly notes, that many philosophers, including themselves, earn our living by discussing.
The author does acknowledge that perhaps this is just Phillips's personal preference for how to define the scope of philosophy. But they also hint that there might be something deeper going on, a more fundamental difference underlying this philosophical disagreement.
Yes. The author speculates that this difference over the proper role and scope of philosophy might actually stem from, or at least be connected to, a more fundamental divergence in religious attitude, or in how one understands the very nature and core of religious faith itself.
And the source indicates that Phillips himself seems to perceive such a difference in religious attitude between his view and the author's view.
That's right. As presented in the source, Phillips apparently draws a contrast between different kinds of religious faith. He seems to distinguish a type of faith that, in his critical portrayal, appears to depend ultimately on ultimate facts, the eschatological situation being favorable. This is described as a faith where if the final outcome, the end reality, isn't good or doesn't vindicate the belief, then the faith itself is rendered a kind of hoax or a failure. Phillips appears to place the author's own position, the position of John Hick, the author of the source text, squarely within this category, suggesting that for Hick, religion's meaning and validity are ultimately tied to a set of empirical facts being or not being the case in the long run.
Phillips uses a very moving and powerful example involving the mothers of mentally handicapped children to try and illustrate this difference he perceives in religious attitudes. Can you walk us through that?
Yes, it's a really poignant example used in the text. Phillips describes encountering one mother whose religious faith apparently sustained her through the immense difficulty of raising her child because she held a firm conviction that her child's place in heaven is secure. Phillips, as interpreted by the author, Hick, seems to characterize this mother's hope as being based on an expectation of later compensation in the afterlife, a hope dependent on certain facts being realized in the future, specifically the fact of heavenly reward. Phillips apparently finds this kind of hope religiously unimpressive, perhaps viewing it as bordering on superstition because it seems conditional on a specific, favorable future factual outcome.
And he contrasts this mother's attitude with that of other mothers facing similar, incredibly difficult circumstances. How did they respond differently, according to Phillips?
Phillips reportedly contrasted the first mother with other mothers who, when faced with the agonizing question, "Why should such a thing have happened?" responded not with an answer, but with a counter-question. "Why shouldn't it happen to me?" Phillips found this counter-question extremely impressive religiously. He suggested it revealed a certain kind of religious belief, seemingly one that finds meaning, acceptance, or perhaps resilience within the midst of the suffering itself, rather than primarily looking towards a future state where the suffering is undone or compensated for. It suggests a faith that is perhaps less contingent on specific favorable factual outcomes, either now or later.
That's a stark contrast. How does the author, Hick, respond to this distinction Phillips draws? Does he accept it as a fundamental difference in kinds of faith? And how does he interpret the example of the mothers?
The author is actually quite cautious here. They express uncertainty about whether this contrast really points to a fundamental religious difference, or perhaps more to differences in theological articulation or emphasis. They first clarify their own view of religion. They explicitly state they do not regard religion primarily as an explanatory hypothesis, designed to account for why suffering happens. Instead, they see religion fundamentally as consciousness of God and as living on the basis of that consciousness. However, they immediately add that this consciousness of God does include certain core beliefs about God's reality, God's nature, including love, and the conviction that the universe, despite all evidence to the contrary at times, is ultimately under the sovereignty of divine love. Regarding the specific example of the mother hoping for her child's place in heaven, the author interprets her hope not merely as a desire for personal compensation, but within the broader framework of core Christian belief. Specifically, the belief that all individuals, including children with severe handicaps, are objects of God's loving care, and are destined to eventually participate fully in the good eschaton, the ultimate fulfillment and perfection of God's creation, symbolically represented as the kingdom of heaven, where in the traditional phrase the author quotes, "All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." This hope, for the author, isn't just wishful thinking about compensation. It's seen as a direct implication of the deeper faith in God's universal loving purpose, a purpose believed to ultimately encompass and bring to fruition the potential of every creature. The author does grant that perhaps the second mother Phillips describes, the one asking, "Why not me?" might not explicitly articulate these theological implications about a future eschaton. Perhaps she simply lives deeply and resiliently on the basis of that fundamental consciousness of God's reality and presence within her difficult situation. The author concedes that maybe Phillips' point is precisely to highlight this kind of deeply lived-out faith that might exist without a fully spelled-out theological or eschatological framework.
But despite acknowledging that possibility, the author still insists that any faith that claims continuity with the New Testament tradition does inherently possess an eschatological dimension, a focus on ultimate realities and the future culmination of God's plan is essential.
Absolutely. The author's quite firm on this. They stress that this eschatological hope, this focus on the ultimate future, isn't just some optional add-on or merely pie in the sky when you die, as the saying goes. They see it as absolutely fundamental to the perspective presented in the New Testament itself. It's presented as a core conviction about God's ultimate reality and the eventual guaranteed sovereignty of divine love over the entire sweep of the temporal process. This guarantees, in the Christian view, the eventual triumph of God's good purpose for the whole of creation, including humanity.
And this whole discussion about dealing with suffering, trusting in divine purpose, and looking towards an ultimate future seems to lead inevitably and directly to the most profound and difficult challenge for any theistic faith, the problem of evil.
It does, inescapably. The author argues that if the term loving is applied to God, and if it's to have any meaning that bears a positive analogy to the best forms of human love, which the author strongly argues it must, drawing support from Jesus' parables which depict God's love in very human terms, then applying this term to the creator of this world with all its evident suffering and evil has massive, unavoidable implications. Specifically, it implies that the evil and suffering we observe, however real and terrible, cannot be the final word. It implies that an infinite good will somehow ultimately emerge from the entire cosmic process, however slowly or painfully that might unfold from our limited human perspective. And this conclusion, the author argues, pushing the logic further, necessarily entails the eventual completion of God's good and loving purpose for individual human beings beyond the confines of this present earthly life.
Why is that specific conclusion, the necessity of a future life beyond death, so crucial and, for the author, seemingly unavoidable if one holds to God's love?
It becomes vital because the author takes a wide-angle view, looking at the sheer, staggering scale of human history and experience across millennia. They explicitly consider the thousands of millions of people throughout history for whom God's good purpose, whatever it might be, is quite manifestly not fulfilled or realized within the limits of their earthly lives. They point to the countless babies who die in infancy. They point to the vast majority of humanity throughout history who have lived and died in conditions of grinding poverty, endemic sickness, political oppression, lacking basic freedoms and opportunities to flourish. They point to the many individuals who are simply crushed, defeated, and destroyed by suffering, not elevated or finding meaning in it, unlike the perhaps exceptional cases Phillips might be drawing on, like Simone Weil or Søren Kierkegaard. The author views Phillips's perspective, if it focuses primarily on those relatively few who find deep meaning in suffering, as potentially spiritually elitist. Why? Because it seems to overlook, or perhaps implicitly disregard, the large and very imperfect mass of humanity, for whom suffering is primarily destructive, and whose human potential is tragically thwarted and unfulfilled in this life. The author's understanding of God's love, rooted in the Christian tradition, is that it enfolds sinners as well as saints, ordinary, struggling, imperfect people, not just a spiritual or intellectual elite who can find meaning in adversity. So for the vast majority of people who have ever lived, their lives on earth have been marked by immense suffering, injustice, and tragically unfulfilled potential. If God's loving purpose is truly universal, truly intended to be brought to completion for every single individual within his creation, if God genuinely loves all his children, then, the author argues with force, there must logically be a further life, a continuation of existence beyond death. Otherwise, the claim that God is genuinely loving and has a good purpose for all humanity seems impossible to sustain honestly in the face of the stark, undeniable reality of widespread earthly suffering and the radical incompleteness of so many human lives. Talk of God's universal love must have concrete implications for future experience beyond death, the author insists, if that love is to have any substantial, non-trivial meaning.
So just to be clear, the argument isn't simply about people getting rewarded in heaven for having suffered on earth, like a simple compensation scheme. It's deeper than that. It's about the fundamental possibility of God's creative purpose itself being fulfilled for each individual human being.
Precisely. That's a much better way to put it. The author frames the necessity of a future life not primarily as compensation, but as the necessary context, the required arena, for God's ultimate creative and redemptive purpose to actually reach its intended completion for every person. If that divine purpose is understood within the Christian framework as eventually drawing all human children into the fullness of the divine life, bringing them to the supreme quality of life, symbolized by terms like the kingdom of heaven or eternal life, then this conviction has, as the author puts it, unavoidable implications concerning the structure and process of the universe. According to the author, therefore, expressions of Christian faith statements about God's love, God's purpose, God's sovereignty are implicitly, by their very nature, also beliefs about the fundamental character of our total environment, the ultimate reality we inhabit. And this deep connection between belief claims and the structure of reality becomes most vivid, most demanding, and perhaps most clear when one seriously confronts the theological problem of evil. The author signals that this profound link between belief, reality, and the challenge of suffering is a central theme they explore in much greater detail elsewhere in their work.
Wow, what a journey through this source material. We really covered a lot of ground. We started by observing that cultural shift the author noticed, where the focus seemed to move away from the reality of God towards discussing the utility and value of religion as primarily a human phenomenon.
Right. And we saw how this pragmatic view could perhaps be interpreted as a kind of surrogate or replacement in an age where traditional faith might seem to be waning, and how sharply it contrasts with the traditional understanding that faith is centered on transcendent, factual truths about a reality that exists independently of our needs or our assessment of its usefulness.
Then we really dove into the complexity of religious language itself. We acknowledged the valid and important place of non-factual elements like myth and symbol within religious traditions, but we followed the author's core argument that such non-factual language only gains its particular religious significance if it's ultimately understood as being built upon, or parasitic upon, a foundation of genuinely factual claims about how reality ultimately is.
And we explored the critique of that other influential idea that religious language is essentially an isolated language game, sort of sealed off from external questions about factual correspondence. We looked closely at the author's counter-argument that typical lived religious language does inherently presuppose the extra-linguistic reality of God, and that asking whether that foundational claim is actually true is not just a legitimate question, but a logically necessary one that arises from the nature of the claim itself.
We also saw those contrasting views on the role of philosophy. Is its job just to clarify concepts within the religious language game, leaving everything as it is? Or can philosophy legitimately, and perhaps importantly, help us evaluate the reasonableness of believing in the reality that those religious concepts seem to point towards?
And finally, we touched on that profound and I think quite demanding connection that the author draws between the claims religious faith makes, especially the powerful claims about the nature of God's universal love and what those claims seem to logically require concerning the ultimate structure of reality and the final destiny of individual human beings, especially when we honestly confront the stark, pervasive reality of suffering, injustice, and unfulfilled potential in this present life.
It's certainly a rich and complex debate. It really forces you, I think, to think deeply about what it actually means to believe, what it means to question, and how we should understand the very language we use when we try to talk about faith, doubt, and ultimate reality.
It definitely underscores the author's central, unwavering insistence that core religious claims are ultimately intended as statements about the way things actually are, and that accepting this understanding has significant, far-reaching, and perhaps unavoidable implications for how we make sense of the world we inhabit and the meaning of human experience within it.
So, for you, our listener, as you reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider the central tension presented throughout this material. Do you see religion primarily as a useful, perhaps powerful human construct, maybe a symbolic system, a way of life, a source of comfort and community? Or do you see it as fundamentally asserting core truths about a reality that exists independently of us, independently of whether we find it useful or whether we happen to believe it? How does the way we lean, even implicitly, on that fundamental question shape our understanding of faith, our approach to philosophy, and maybe most importantly, how we grapple with the deepest challenges and mysteries of life itself, challenges like suffering, and the enduring question of what, if anything, happens after death?
Those are the big questions, all right? Keep exploring them.
Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. We really hope it's given you plenty to think about.